come here today and to see where he spent a part of his life, a very difficult part of his life, is, I have to say, it's quite overwhelming.
This is one of the earliest pictures I've ever seen of him, because he would only have been about 20.
This is where the miners would work.
Unbelievable. I remember when I joined the family, how pleased he was that I was from an Indian family. It mattered.
Allied squadrons take the air for another great battle over Europe.
It was the deadliest conflict in human history. World War II drew in men and women from all over the globe and claimed the lives of around 80 million people. 75 years ago this month, after almost 6 long years of fighting, the end of the war was officially declared. There aren't many people who don't have some sort of family connection to that war. To mark its end, 4 presenters from BBC News, including myself, are telling the stories of our relatives, the roles they played, what they did, whether here on the home front, in the Atlantic, or deep in Burma's jungle. We start with Mashal Hussain and her grandfather. He was one of more than 2 million men who fought for Britain in the Indian Army.
They served in deserts and jungles, from African battlefields to Asia and in Europe. And without what was then the British Indian Army, the war might not have been won. It's all commemorated here at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, which has trained officers for generations, and where this entire room honours the contribution of South Asian troops through successive conflicts in different parts of the world. My grandfather, Sayyid Shahid Hamid, was at university in northern India when he found out he'd won a place at Sandhurst. It was 1932, and he was one of the few Indian cadets.
I'd like to show you this lovely photograph of your grandfather. It's part of the Royal Military College 2nd 6th tennis team. Name there, and you'll spot him there.
Yes. This is one of the earliest pictures I've ever seen of him, because he would only have been about 20 at this point.
Back home, he became a husband and father, and as war broke out, India began to play a central role.
No praise is too high for these fine men who are doing so much for the empire.
When Britain went into the war, it was an imperial endeavour, and the imagination was that everybody around the empire would come to help and to serve and save the motherland.
So what was India's contribution within that?
So India's contribution is mainly manpower. There are vast numbers of men recruited, but it also produces raw materials, uniforms, timber, goods, cotton. There's a lot of drive to build up factories, munitions factories in India itself.
From December 1941, the conflict came closer to India as Japanese offensives threatened British strongholds in Asia. Shahid was ordered to Burma, his ship arriving in Rangoon as an airstrike was taking place.
If you land up in a harbour and you find yourself in the middle of an enemy bombing raid, it couldn't be a pleasant experience.
It was the first of many searing experiences which have been pieced together by my uncle Ali.
When the Japanese surrounded Rangoon, they blocked the road, and he writes that there was a column of over 40 miles long. Where's the water coming from? Where's the food coming from? What's happening to the injured?
What did he see of the plight of the civilians, all of those who were trying to get away from the Japanese invasion?
The plight of the civilians is terrible. He says that a stage came where they were offering a fistful of rupees for a fistful of rice.
Burma would soon fall to the Japanese, and Shahid later reflected upon the perils of the time.
It was terrible when the wooden houses caught fire and the ammunition dumps started exploding. I was blown into a trench and thought that I'd been hit and could not open my eyes. The picture that emerges from these pages is of the intensity of this period in Burma, and I didn't realize until now what my grandfather faced from the very moment that he arrived. And for him, it comes to a very sudden end when an injury to his eyes means that he is evacuated back to India in April 1942.
Some of those who lived through those years are still with us today, veterans of an army made up not of conscripts
but volunteers, and who joined up for many reasons.
Very the poor people.
For Inayat Ali, it was a livelihood.
When the British asked us to help, we thought there is no work available. So instead of going hungry, we would do this.
And there was the hope that if the British won the war, they would give India its independence.
In many ways, that greater rise in nationalism that's taking place in India is reflected in the army. There is a greater sense that these young men and officers who are coming through in particular, many of them are nationalists and they believe in actually achieving a greater status for India. Whilst they may not be enthusiastically pro-Raj, what they definitely are anti is anti-Japanese occupation. The army that defeats the Japanese, we refer to often as the British Indian Army. It is an Indian army that defeats the Japanese. Whilst they are fighting on the British side, who they're really fighting for is India.
After the war, my grandfather continued his military career and had a long life. Others were not so fortunate. A war that drew in many countries means that today some lie far from home. Their service is commemorated, but their stories are slipping further into the past. Now it is up to us to remember, to learn, to be grateful for the courage of those who went before.
Michelle Hussein and the extraordinary story of her grandfather. Well, fighting a conflict on this scale required immense resources and constant supplies. Much of it was transported by sea. The Merchant Navy delivered supplies to Britain and to the troops who were serving abroad. But it was a dangerous job. The Merchant Navy suffered one of the highest casualty rates. Hugh Edwards tells the story of his grandfather, who served with the Atlantic convoys.
The story begins in the tiny seaside village of Llanddewi Aberarth on the coastline of Ceredigion. This is where I'd come to visit my grandparents, and this is the little house where they lived. Nothing much has changed in the main street. And you can see the house in the background to this family photo, which was taken after the war and my grandfather's return after 4 years away. He'd gone to sea in the first instance at the age of 14 in 1920. It was the natural thing to do for the boys in the village. But as he told me, many years later, never could he have imagined that that first voyage as a merchant seaman would lead eventually to 3 years in a German prisoner of war camp.
This is a story of the men who braved the dangers of the sea to bring us our daily bread.
The men of the Merchant Navy faced terrifying danger as they kept Britain supplied with food and raw materials. All too often, they were easy targets for the German battleships and U-boats.
The U-boats used to hunt in packs, and they always aimed for the merchant ships because they were seen as being the ships that were keeping the Britain and the other places afloat. So the more merchant ships they could sink, the more vulnerable we became.
In early 1941, my grandfather was working on the SS Stanpark. They had picked up supplies at Cape Town and they were heading home when they met with disaster off the coast of West Africa. The convoy had been spotted by a German battleship called the Admiral Scheer. My grandfather's ship was sunk and he and the crew were taken back to Bordeaux in France before being sent on to a prisoner of war camp in Germany. I'm a little bit nervous about seeing the site itself because I've no idea what to expect. But I'm really keen to take it all on board. And this is the site of that camp at Sant Bostel, and I'm the first member of my family to retrace some of his steps. I've been waiting, I suppose, 40 years to see this since I first was aware of my grandfather's story. So to come here today and to see where he spent a part of his life, a very difficult part of his life, is, I have to say, it's quite overwhelming. I was shown around by the local historian and guide Ines de Rolf, who explained the layout of the camp to me.
These huts were meant to be like 250 prisoners of war in each hut. And then 4 huts had to use 1 latrine. So, when some of the prisoners of war were here, those huts were highly overcrowded.
So how many do you think would have been in there at that time?
Nearly 400.
Wow. What I really want is just to see inside one of these huts. So maybe you can tell me.
You're very welcome to do so.
What is, what's this? Gosh, it's...
Now we are inside one of the wooden huts which were used for the prisoners of war. This is the nearly original size of one of the chambers of this wooden hut. And just imagine, like about, let's say, 40 prisoners of war in just this little room.
Gosh.
We think prisoners of war slept on the very ground, without any beds and without any sort of blankets. Which explains the high death rate. So, and during the daytime, prisoners of war could leave those huts, but not so in the nighttime.
In fact, more than 300,000 prisoners of 55 nationalities were held here during the war.
This is an example for a hut from the first generation of huts here.
So when my grandfather came here, it would have been in a very similar building to this, but just a few metres away. After a period at San Bostel, my grandfather and his fellow prisoners were marched some 15 miles away to a place called Vestatimka, where they built another camp called Milag Nord. The trouble here in Vestatimka is that there is no physical evidence of the camp that was here. The camp where my grandfather spent most of his time in captivity. It was beyond these trees somewhere. But all that remains of that camp today is this memorial to the 5,000 merchant seamen who were held here. How many of them would stop at this memorial, do you think? But that's not the only memorial to the Merchant Navy, of course, the most prominent of which is here in Greenwich, a reminder of the dangers the men faced.
You've a 50% chance of not making it at these peak points in the conflict, and conditions would be poor, your pay was poor, and your recognition was also not up there with the armed forces.
Without the Merchant Navy, we could not have won World War II. It's as simple as that.
My grandfather did make it home to West Wales before the end of the war, and despite fragile health, he lived to the age of 85. Always modest, always hard-working, and always grateful. In a rare comment on his difficult wartime experience, he said simply this: "I was very lucky." And he always thought of the tens of thousands of merchant seamen who did not return, but who made such a vital contribution to Britain's survival in the Second World War.
Hugh Edwards and the story of his grandfather and the Atlantic convoys. Well, thousands of miles away on the other side of the world, hundreds and thousands of Allied troops were engaged in one of the most defining and brutal campaigns of the war. They were fighting the Japanese in Burma, now known as Myanmar, for the 14th Army, led by General Slim. It was a truly multinational force. But as war in Europe came to an end, the war in the Far East raged on, and the soldiers became known as the Forgotten Army. Rita Chakrabarti tells the story of her father-in-law, who was one of them.
The great news ran through the land.
Jubilation across the UK. The war in Europe was finally over. But thousands of miles away in Burma, Allied troops were still fighting a formidable enemy, Japan. They became a forgotten army in a forgotten war, but one whose course shaped the future of many lives. It led to a parting gift from a former enemy becoming a symbol of love in my own family. My father-in-law, Patrick John Rogers Hamilton, was 23 when World War II started. Home for Patrick was Scotland, and after the war broke out, he joined the Gordon Highlanders Regiment in Aberdeen, before being sent to India and then to Burma.
That's him there, second row, a smiling face.
At his home in Aberdeen, my brother-in-law Mark recalled his father's enthusiasm for India.
He was thrilled to be there, in a way. Obviously the circumstances were unpleasant, and to be sucked away from your nearest and dearest was a difficult thing for so many. But he was delighted that he had the opportunity to go to India. He taught members of the the Garwol Regiment how to play the pipes, so that's quite remarkable.
Right, and I remember when I joined the family, how pleased he was that I was from an Indian family.
Oh, yes.
It mattered.
Patrick's military career had started with the Gordon Highlanders Regiment. I wanted to trace his journey, so I went to the Regimental Museum to learn more.
The regiment here is the story of Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire. It's just ordinary folk going to all these places and doing extraordinary things.
Show me some
yeah.
more. Thank you.
So this is the register of soldiers for the Gordon Highlanders, and you can see from this list his service number and the fact that he joined the Gordon Highlanders in August 1940. I've probably done his officer training in India and jungle warfare training in India before he joined the Indian Army.
So he had to leave the Gordon Highlanders in order to be...
Yeah, the Indian Army was really short of officers.
But Patrick was not long in India. The Japanese had taken neighbouring Burma in 1942, and his regiment became part of the huge 14th Army, which fought to win it back. It was an immense force of around 1 million men, but it became the forgotten army as Europe's focus was on itself. The men fought in the towns and jungles of Burma in atrocious conditions. Those back home could only imagine the horrors. My mother-in-law, Jenny, still not married to Patrick, wrote to him, "My darling Patrick, I've been feeling for you tonight, and I'm full of sympathy for you. They're putting more and more in the papers about this 14th Army campaign, and I feel nothing can be too good to make up for such a hell."
Well, we had a very bad war in the Far East.
Veteran John Giddings was one of those men in Burma living that hell.
We lost quite a number of lads through night attacks and bombing attacks, of course. That bad raid at Magui, where we lost 50 in an air raid, terrible. I suppose in a way we were always known as a forgotten army. The history books tell people how difficult it was, but of course it's not just like being there.
In May 1945, it was the final push.
It's mud, mud and still more mud. But Rangoon is the capital of Burma and biggest prize of the whole campaign.
Rangoon's recapture by Allied forces weakened Japan before its final surrender a few months later. Field Marshal Viscount Slim led the campaign in Burma. His grandson Mark Slim told me why his grandfather's army should no longer be forgotten.
It was a very tough campaign. It was fought over great distances with insufficient resources in an environment that was riddled with disease. But they all made the most of it, and they united and they worked as a very thorough team, and they took great pride in overcoming the odds.
As if war weren't enough, those on the front line had to contend with other, more personal matters.
Interestingly, there's a telegram here which he received a few days after his father died, which was sent, and I guess that was a kind of brutal way of receiving that news. And the detail of it, he didn't receive some 3 or 4 months later.
And no time to grieve?
No, too much involved, yeah.
What does it make you feel looking at this and thinking about him? Sort of proud.
Definitely.
Everyone in the family is proud of Patrick, and we all feel we've got to know him better now as a result of making this film. And out of the horrors of the war he endured came this token of love. It's a ring that was given to him by a Japanese officer. It's got his initials engraved on it, and he wore this as his wedding ring when he finally married Jenny.
Rita Chakrabarti and the story of her father-in-law. Millions of men served abroad during World War II, but some who signed up to go to war instead found themselves forced to stay at home and go hundreds of metres underground in Britain's coal mines. Conditions were harsh, injury rates were high. My grandfather was a surgeon. He used his medical skills to help keep the war effort going on the home front.
And its title, translated into English, is The Girl with the Flaxen Hair.
His name was Ernest Alexander Nicol, a passionate pianist and a pioneering surgeon. As war broke out, coal was desperately needed to fuel the fight against the Nazis. At one point, Britain almost ran out of supplies. My grandfather, then in his late 30s, began helping some of the tens of thousands of miners on the home front, injured underground. At the National Coal Mining Museum in Yorkshire, you can still experience what life was like in the war years. It was a dangerous job.
There you go, what's your name?
I think what really strikes me coming down here is how people manage to cope coming in here day after day, working in these conditions, and the permanent threat of being injured, of being killed.
Yeah, it became a way of life for the miners. You know, they were sort of brought up in mining families, and generation after generation would be working in the mines, so it was sort of in the blood. And this is where the miners would work. They'd drive the machine and it'd drill and blast the coal face and shovel it all onto this conveyor.
Unbelievable. There were terrible accidents. There were blasts going off. The wood was creaking.
Yes. It'd be mainly broken limbs and broken backs, and these all came from getting buried under rock falls.
And once they had an injury as bad as a broken back, the chances of them getting back to work were quite slim.
Yes, it'd be very slim. They certainly wouldn't be coming back down the mine working in these conditions.
My grandfather lived in the heart of mining communities in Nottinghamshire, where he worked as a surgeon. He decided to use his skills to help miners get back to work. And this is Berry Hill Hall, a country home that in 1939 my grandfather transformed into the first rehabilitation centre for injured miners. It was pioneering the work that he led here, and by the end of World War II there were 6 more centres just like this one that had opened up in mining communities across the north of England.
Then a plaster case is applied to prevent any movement in the
And here he is, filmed during the war for a government video to highlight his work. He focused on building up muscle strength after injury, with up to 3 hours a day in a specially built gym and occupational therapy. 95% of his patients went back down the mines.
Berry Hill Hall was very, very important. It had that crucial kind of role in providing that rehabilitation service then to this large group of industrial workers who were at risk of these kinds of injuries and these impairments and disabilities. So it does play an important role then in getting very large numbers of such injured workers to a level of fitness where they can return to work.
That's me.
93-year-old Harry Parks was forced down the mines as a teenager. He thought he was going to war. Instead, like almost 50,000 men, he was conscripted as a Bevan boy, as they were known.
I hated every day of going to the pit. To start with, I was frightened to death because we knew, being in a mining area, that I think it was 1,000 men killed every year working in a coal mine. But if we didn't go, it was on pain of imprisonment. Because I was a conscript, I felt that I should be fighting for my country. I wasn't allowed to do that.
Ernest Bevin was speaking out for the British people.
The Bevan boys were named after the wartime Minister of Labour, Ernest Bevin, who had been charged with increasing Britain's coal production. He decided that 1/10 of the young men who'd signed up to go to war would instead go down the mines to replace those who were fighting abroad. The number of serious accidents increased as pressure grew on the mines to extract more and more coal.
It was done on a ballot system, so they had the numbers 0 to 9 in a hat. And Bevan's secretary picked out a number randomly every fortnight, and if your registration ended with that number, you were conscripted to the mines. So you had men who would have been training to go into the Air Corps or to the Air Force, and they ended up being conscripted to work underground.
Well, we never had a uniform. We had to buy our own gear, clothes and boots and helmets when we worked at the pit. You were going into whatever the danger was, you had to do it. You were a conscript, and so you did what you were told.
This is a nerve injury.
Miners were 5 times more likely to have an accident than other workers on the home front. My grandfather treated more than 1,000 a year at the local hospital.
Where did you go that he worked? My mother was a young child but vividly remembers going to work with him.
We went to Berry Hill Hall, and I can remember it had a lovely big lawn. I don't think I ever went inside the building. I was only about 6 or 7, it was a very long time ago, but we used to play on the lawn. That's where all the exercises took place, I think.
He also took her to his fracture clinic on hospital visits.
Every Saturday morning we went to Mansfield General Hospital to do a ward round, and he would put on his white coat and we'd sweep in. And he was made such a fuss of, and then we went all round all the patients, chatting to each one.
After the war, Ernest Nicol carried on his work with miners. He spent the rest of his life working as an orthopaedic surgeon in the NHS and playing the piano, a showman to the very end. My grandfather, Nico as he liked to be called, he was playing the piano until the very end when he died at the age of 92. He was just one of millions of people who played their part in the People's War.